JAWGS, Journey to Mars, audiobook prototype '03 written by Mike Whitus and read by natural readers, English voice John. Chapter 1, The Dull Days. It is a dull Tuesday morning, and I know it's dull because I have experienced some extraordinary things. I have a friend that invited me on a journey that I never thought we would return from, and this is the account thereof. Now let's see. Oh yes, my friend's name is Shawsmo Karen, a smooth-talking good-hearted individual from southern Florida. I had previously had dealings with him in Europe and was looking forward to what he called a summer get-together with business opportunities galore. On the event, he continued ranting on about how NASA and ESA had approached him due to his ad hoc problem-solving skills and background with a secret organization in America, all very hush-hush of course, and quite unbelievable. So I felt rather startled when an envelope containing a one-way ticket to Fort Myers arrived in my hands a dull workday morning, much like this one. Being a former pilot, now struggling freelance illustrator and dreamer, it wasn't hard to find the time to go on such a grand adventure, especially since it sounded prepaid. I liked that. The flight wasn't too bad. Due to my small stature, I don't suffer many of the nuisances that other individuals do on long-haul flights. I was being taken to Florida. Shaws would be waiting there to pick me up. At the airport I nearly lost my luggage. It would have been a tragedy. Where could one find premium top hats in the Americas? Luckily I recovered it before I had a panic attack. When I finally got through security and met Shaws, he was being his usual whimsical self. He was jittery about something, but somehow kept a lid on it. I was busy enjoying the ride in his Bravo Romeo anyway. Ever since the auto industry switched to electric propulsion, traveling by car has been one of my favorite pastimes. We arrived in the sunny town of Cocoa, a short drive from Cape Canaveral. I was beginning to feel like Shaws hadn't been joking about his involvement with secret organizations and the space agencies. After a splendid cafe dinner we took a walk along the Cocoa waterfront, the city on the other coast obscuring the horizon, Shaws humming to himself, and I thoroughly enjoyed the cooling Atlantic winds.
Well, right on time are we? I see you brought your friend Mr. Mokaran.
A large basking rose from his bench and newspaper, smiling at us. Shaws lit up, clearly excited.
Yes. This is the pilot I've been telling you about.
I sent Shaws a questioning stare. My piloting days were behind me. Since automated flight it had been hard to find honest work driving planes. He knew that. Shaws gently pushed me forwards.
Let me introduce Nady. Him and I have a fair amount of history together.
The basker smiled, his giant mouth like a living gateway with friendly eyes.
Nice to meet you, Nady. Most people call me said Maximus. If you must know, it's a mouthful. Like me.
His voice had a Russian twang, his bellowing laughter did as well, and he shook my hand a little too roughly.
It's time.
Shaws turned around eagerly, facing east. Said looked at his phone.
Yes, they should have launched by now.
I didn't have the faintest clue as to what they were discussing, but turned my eyes skywards to bear witness. In the distance, over the city noises, a rumbling could be heard, and as it grew louder, a light appeared low in the Cocoa skyline. A trio of lights. Followed by billowing smoke trails, they rose, first into the bright blue horizon and then slowly translating to the dark blue meat of the heavens.
You know what those are, Nate?
Shaws asked. Satellite launches from NASA, I asked testingly.
Nope, those are the final robots for the second launch of Halcyon, my friend. It's what we're here for.
Shores smiled mysteriously. Said grinned.
All right, let's not keep him waiting.
He said, lumbering away from us.
Doc sent a bus to pick us up.
The skybus pulled up a few minutes later. It was a large reflective thing that hummed gracefully to a standstill as its doors slowly exposed its innards.
Dear passengers, please enter and enjoy your ride to Cape Canaveral.
The automated voice changed pitch as it pronounced the destination. I barely noticed. I was still trying to cope with the prospect of being involved with ISS Halcyon, the fabled Mars-bound ark that almost all of the world's spacefaring nations had been laboring away at over the last decade. The sleek vehicle maneuvered to cruising altitude following the aerial express lanes horizontally parallel to most of the city's old land-based boulevards. Holographic commercials were littered in the intervals between aerial buoys that visually indicated safe autonomous fly zones. I felt the amputated sting of my former airborne profession. Computers simply were better at navigating the grids on Earth. It didn't make sense to introduce rogue intelligences like myself into a binary constellation that worked so flawlessly on its own. And so I had been deprecated like many other pilots, having to adapt to new career paths in management or some other non-computerized role. The transition had been painful to me. For once you have experienced flight, you will forever wander with your eyes turned skywards, for there you have been. And there you will long to return. I remembered the words, but forgot their author. Nevertheless, it was fundamentally true to me.
Nady, I hope you understand that you play an integral and very important role in our endeavor.
Shores turned around and smiled at me. We were about to dismount the skybus and he was unbuckling his seatbelt.
You're gonna have to learn zero-G maneuvering over the next couple of days. Luckily we have a very capable instructor on hand.
Shores mused.
Shores is in love.
Are you gonna be that way all the way to Mars, buddy?
He winked to Said and disembarked the idling craft smoothly. Said lumbered down the cramped corridor in front of me, eclipsing my view of the exit hatch. Cape Canaveral was everything I had imagined. Tight security, busy traffic consisting of all kinds of strange vehicles, hauling cargo, exotic liquids or gases, and then the occasional security cruiser or personal transport. Landing pad Papa 4 Delta where we had been deposited was sparse, consisting solely of the pad itself and a small building to house waiting passengers, in this case the occupants numbered 1. A beautiful young female lemon skin that quickly rose from one of the standardized plastic bucket seats.
Well, you're a bit late, aren't you, Shores? You really want to keep Doc waiting like that?
Her accent sounded foreign, maybe French? Her frown was internationally accent-free though. Shores smiled and countered.
When he sees this little guy, I am sure I will be forgiven the 5 minutes I'm past our agreed rendezvous.
He winked to her smoothly. She was gorgeous, I could tell he liked her. She ignored him and scrutinized me. I did my best top hat greet and bow while pronouncing my old boast. Best bush pilot this side of Duchamps. She wasn't impressed.
Let's see if your bush driving skills are worth anything in zero-G, mister.
She said, making Shores laugh heartily.
Priz is a former Navy pilot with over 10,000 hours logged on close support VTOLs.
Shores said. Navy jocks were hardcore, I could respect that. I wondered what they needed me for. The group kept a lively conversation on the automated stairwell and access way down towards what looked like food courts and office areas. I was too busy absorbing the impressions that I almost fell when the animated sidewalk finally terminated, giving Said an opportunity to comment on my short stature. I liked the jargon already. It reminded me of the army camaraderie I had been without for so long. A part of the food court was under construction or had yet to be labeled in franchise names and exciting offers to compete with the colorful statements opposite. Get a fresh seaweed salad with every krill purchase, or get your scallop game on tonight with Canaveral clams. Sports had never really been my thing. I would honestly try to get into it, but as a scatterbrain I had never really had that good a memory for names. Logos, patterns and colors though, they stuck like glue. the same with faces opposite of names. My mind was wandering. Without noticing it, we had maneuvered ourselves into the labyrinthine under-construction area. Shaw's and Said were both very silent. The slick young female had procured a key card and had increased her pace. I was trying to keep up, her high heels setting a staccato rhythm on the marble floor in concert with my efforts. After what seemed to be an endless series of corners and junctions, we arrived at an elevator door. Priz expertly slid the key card through a previously hidden opening in the wall. The doors slid open and we entered. Everything was very unmarked and unusual. The anonymous lift descended downwards for several seconds. I was getting seahorses in my stomach. They had mentioned zero-G maneuvering and Shaw's had been talking about Mars and Halcyon. What was I getting myself into? I considered making an update on Fishbook, but who was going to believe me, and really, who would find my budding adventure interesting in an online community saturated by images of food, baby squids and political mud wrestling? Besides, I was pretty sure Shaw's said something about secrecy. Bing! Like a microwave alarm, the lift announced our destination and gravity seemed to increase for a moment as the brakes applied themselves. The doors slid open and revealed a security checkpoint. Two large orcanoids scowled from behind their pastimes and CCTV monitors.
Afternoon, Captain. Who's that little fellow you're bringing in there?
One of the big guys prompted to Priz, while pointing at the holo display being projected from the desk. She stepped up and cycled through a few menus. I was idly checking out the room, like the professional I was. When I got bored being a pro, I turned to spying on what Priz was doing and discovered to my fright that most of my background information was rapidly rolling through the holo prompt she was operating. Things I didn't even remember was flickering across the display. I started getting the authority sweats, the kind you get when you know you're being background checked and there is nothing to worry about, but you get nervous anyway. One of the orcas leaned in close to me.
Everything looks fine, Sergeant. Good to see you're coming back in the system.
He chuckled, leaning back and pushed the door release. Shaw's winked to me as Prison Said marched onwards through the checkpoint.
Yes, Sarge, good to see you're coming back in.
He smiled.
Let's go.
I picked up the pace as he beckoned to follow. We proceeded through several corridors with brown doors bearing names of presumably scientific occupants. The doors were accompanied by large wall decorations of galaxies and early space race orbital vessels and habitats, from the Russian Squidnik probe to the Traveler satellites, even the prototypes that never got off the ground. I especially liked the artwork depicting Julius Vernius' Space Launch Cannon system, or the imagined atomic propulsion systems of the late 20th century. The place had a tint of old future about it, which did plenty to fuel my excitement. Finally, after passing a small tea kitchen, where the only living resident seemed to be a sputtering old warhorse of a coffee maker, we made it to a door with the name Dr. Sione Odson on it. Priz knocked on the door, gently calling out,
Doc, are you there?
She leaned into the dim light, as she pushed the door aside. The door frame revealed a cluttered office with an old brown desk as its centerpiece. Myriads of printouts and text pages torn from books hung around the room, and the only light source was a bulb decorated with notes taped to its lampshade, emitting an eerie light and scribbly shadow play on the interior walls. Behind the old desk a ponderous turtle altered his thinking pose to gaze at the intruders.
Doc, this is the pilot we've been discussing. He's here now.
Priz tried again.
Doc?
And again. Doc's unresponsiveness was unwavering. He raised a hand though, and after a few seconds, gave a short speech on trajectories and burn intervals that seemed to come from out of nowhere. Priz put her finger to her mouth to indicate silence from the rest of the party. Apparently Doc was on a conference call, with no visible device. The one-sided dialogue went on for a few more minutes until Doc excused himself and through a hand gesture ended the conversation. He turned to our group and smiled.
Well, he is of short stature, isn't he?
I wasn't sure if I should be offended, but stepped forward to shake the turtle's hand. I hear you're in need of a travel-size driver, I countered, my wits working overtime.
Yes, we have an opening for your exact specifications, son.
Doc's thick Texan accent hung on every syllable.
But first I'm gonna have to brief you fellers on what kind of a journey y'all are about to embark on.
He beckoned to follow as he lumbered further into the dimly lit office, ploughing a path through discarded printouts, charts and reports scattered on the floor. He produced a chart that described the lunar orbit and in a serious tone began to explain the intricate math behind our adventure. They had built Halcyon to create a colony on the Moon and Mars and beyond. But the Moon was the most important. The colony there would prototype almost any type of future colonies, and it would be impossible for the Halcyon robots to achieve every aspect of the mission without astronauts to iron out potential glitches. I must admit I found the technical aspects of my first grand space adventure to be fascinating. But the further we got into the mathematics of gravity, the heavier my eyelids got, and slowly I drifted off into a mental maelstrom of spiraling numbers, with me riding a roller coaster resembling a giant spinning orrery accompanied by a jazzy Nova Trek theme. So many pretty stars. So much math. Like an old spoken album record of algorithmic poetry.
Nate.
Shaw's was nudging me awake. I slowly clawed my way back to the realm of the not dreaming, and as I regained control of my optical faculties, Doc's voice became tangible once again.
And this is where you come in, little feller. You want a hot cup of joe before I start briefing ya on the intricacies of OD.
His voice dry like a desert. OD? My eyes widened. I had no idea what that was other than a reference to that dogfish companion of the Cuddlefield catfish cartoon story from the papers.
ODAV is the space forklift of Halcyon. We figured we would need an EVA vehicle that could assist in reassembling Halcyon once all the modules get relaunched from the lunar surface.
Doc smirked and pointed at me.
You'll be driving that vehicle.
Doc produced a printout from one of the many stacks of paper on his desk.
Kinda looks like a squid done it.
Doc giggled and told us all about the many features of OD. It turned out that the main reason I was the best candidate was that the cockpit was extremely cramped. The vehicle needed to be as light as possible to fit onto one of Halcyon's standard docking ports, and I was the best pilot they could find with the right dimensions on such short notice. I never knew my long line of height-related difficulties could be turned around like this. It all started to make sense. Or so I thought. Pardon me, Doc, but why is the Halcyon capsules being relaunched from the lunar surface? I thought Halcyon was meant to go to Mars. I asked eagerly, trying to understand the bigger picture.
Ah yes, you see son, getting to Mars is not such a pickle as we once thought. The real problem is creating an affordable supply chain that can support whichever biological investment we make in Mars. Robots are fine, they run on power, be it collected from the sun, Martian thermal capacities or atomics. Us aquanoids are a different matter altogether. We require a steady input of nutrition, clean water, oxygen and very specific temperatures to be comfortable. Now you might say we could just send a rocket shipment directly to Mars every now and then, like the air bridge in Berlin back in the late 1940s. But the investment is simply too steep when you factor in the cost of escaping Earth's gravity well every time, so a smart turtle would place his money on a more sustainable alternative. Like the one I devised.
Doc grinned deviously. Shaw's nodded and chimed in.
It is actually quite clever, Nate. Doc figured we didn't need to keep sending all the heavy stuff like the massive propulsion unit on Halcyon into orbit. If it's already there, then we would only need to deliver the only things we can't reproduce outside of Earth's atmosphere, like water, air and foods, which we can handle via the small rocket systems, created by subcontractors like Space Z, Virgo, Cyan Oregon and other contributors like the Russian, Chinese and French space agencies. So that already cuts costs in money and CO2 emissions globally. But the really clever part is how Halcyon uses the Moon's orbital velocity to gain a free speed boost towards Mars.
Shaw's looked speculatively at Doc, who was smiling at him.
2,300 miles per hour?
Shaw's asked testingly.
Close enough.
Doc laughed. I whistled. That's faster than I expected, I thought to myself. Sed and Pris were patiently reading through reports, conveniently lounging on furniture they had liberated from piles of books and technical manuals.
The Halcyon project is easiest to explain if you imagine it as a very large truck that conveys cargo between two gas stations, strategically placed on the Moon and Phobos, Mars's biggest moon.
Doc had found a poster-size visualization of the Halcyon travel path which indicated several orbits and, to my surprise, very few straight lines. The old turtle looked around the room and spoke again.
Y'all are gonna be assisting the artificial intelligence onboard our interplanetary freight hauler, and since this is the first manned mission, you will also have to help out in its duties when it's creating the two gas stations from your cargo and the previous launch. All in all, you have to make sure the Martian habitat ends up the way we planned. Luckily, the cargo you're bringing along is several families of autonomous robo-vehicles, industrial 3D printers and supplies enough to keep you four alive for more than 6 months.
I straightened in confusion. 6 months? That's not nearly enough. Won't the round trip take us more like 18 months? Doc raised an eyebrow. Shaw's was hushing me.
Dear son.
Doc looked at me and continued.
Apparently you're not aware of the progress made in plasma propulsion. NASA has been co-developing the idea with a company called Astronix for more than a decade. Maybe it's been too hush-hush, but it works, and we installed 4 of those drives in the propulsion end of Halcyon. From the time you leave the Moon, you should be in the vicinity of Mars no more than 40 days later. This baby is fast once it gets going. That's why it needs an almost equal amount of conventional rockets to slow it down once it gets there. See, Halcyon is mirrored, but the front is the lander and retro booster all in one, whereas the stern delivers the plasma jalapeno experience that shortens your trip so much, and everything is locally controlled by your onboard AI.
Sed stood up and joined the party.
Yeah, your first meeting with Blue Omnipotent Dragon Child will be very enjoyable. He is Chinese and programmed with a humoristic personality that we have all learned to love so far. We call him Bob.
He informed us, in a very matter-of-factly Russian fashion. Shaw's released a short burst of air that revealed his disagreement with Sid's statement. Pris smiled and countered.
Uncle Bob is Halcyon's intelligent user interface. He also monitors the robot families. Traveling to another planetoid is an interesting concept on several levels. One of them is land ownership, which sounds kind of stupid, but in reality, all the contributing nations want a slice of the cake once the first colony is working properly, which conflicts a little with the existing international laws that state that no nation can own land on another planet, but there is nothing we can do.
I rolled my eyes at the typical greedy political bull that seemed to have crept its way into the project. Pris winked at me and continued.
The robot families are the representatives of the participating nations. They actually have some very colorful names. The American Family, for instance, is named after that Pac-Man game from the arcade, so our 4 robots are called Pinky, Blinky, Inky, and Clyde, whereas the French family members are called D'Artagnan, Athos, Porthos, and Aramis. The Russians are father, mother, daughter, and son, and I can't pronounce the Chinese family names. But all in all, we're hauling those 4 families, each consisting of 2 multi-robots. The big ones, 1 spider and 1 flyer. Our cargo also contains everything we need to build the 2 moon refueling points, so our job is just to facilitate what Bob needs. Hopefully he knows how the families are doing at all times, or we will have to establish patrols if communications break down, but it shouldn't, since everything is redundantly Wi-Fi networked.
She clicked her tongue as a conclusion. I finger-gunned her smartly and said, Murphy's Law states that anything that can go wrong, will go wrong. She patted me on the head, leaning in, and whispered venomously,
That's what we have fail-safes for, sweetie.
She walked away and I mentally noted not to finger-gun her again, ever. Said was chuckling. It reminded me of some large percussion instrument. Baskers had huge vocal organs and many rose to become bass voices in bands. Actors or apparently loud-mouthed cynics like said, he was all right, I guess.
Smooth little fish.
He finally said. Shores and Doc were both discussing something, and when they noticed the lull in our conversation they shook hands and Shores gestured for us to leave. Said did a parody of a salute which left Doc smiling as he shuffled towards the workstation he had been engaged with as we entered. My friend, the hammerhead, marched down the corridor at a brisk pace and said muddled along with me.
You think you're ready for Hell Month?
Said inquired humorously. I looked up in total surprise. Hell Month, I countered.
Is what Shores calls basic aquanaut training.
Said muttered to himself.
I think it's a term he picked up with the U.S. SEAL program.
He smiled. Without really thinking I inquired if said had any military background, and he looked at me mysteriously, made a short salute and said,
Там, где мы, там победа.
To this day I'm certain said used to be a very dangerous individual with an infinite supply of military anecdotes, but that left me as the only relatively untrained participant of the party, so at that time I wondered if my endeavors flying bush planes would grant me any kind of control merit over this OD Doc had mentioned. Hopefully enough to make an impression amongst these highly versatile individuals. Hell Month, as it turns out, was a very fitting name. Hellish cardio training accompanied by some of the classic G-force tests, weightlessness training, low oxygen complex problem solving, zero-G tube meals, zero-G toilet training, etc. Many of these I had heard of and some I had already experienced. NASA's vomit rocket wasn't as bad as its reputation, especially when you're used to doing hard G-turns in a bush plane. You can handle a bumpy ride in a steel tube the size of an aqueduct. I am sure my lack of nausea annoyed said a little. He's a good-tempered giant, but he has a tendency to crack evil jokes about my primary shortcoming, as he calls it, referring to my height. One day I told him that the universe was made up of protons, neutrons and electrons, and in his case morons. Luckily he didn't mind the backtalk. Cardio training used to be my thing, but ever since I was forced to abandon my profession, flying STOL cabins, I had grown soft. Reawakening my body and losing the extra pounds I had gained turned out to be a lot harder than I thought. My trick, as it turns out, wasn't so much the running and getting up early in the morning. It was nuts. Actual nuts. I diverged my diet from raw meat, protein and fats to effing nuts. It worked. I felt completely full after a bag of hazelnuts. That and giving up sugar and alcohol did it. I mean, I didn't become the mean lean flying machine I used to be, but I dropped the extra cargo that kept me from running in the vicinity of my old track records. I was so proud I got myself a brand spanking new flight suit. The baggy old suit I had been sporting for the last month was becoming wide around the waist anyway. I felt like a million. About 2 months after Hell Month, we were joined by the embodiment of Bob, a drone extension that allowed him to interact physically with our team. We needed to integrate with the AI. Or that's what the agency demanded. Bob was a quirky fellow though, maybe it was his Chinese background, but many of his jokes were a bit off, making a potentially hilarious situation just very awkward. As a floating reference library he was invaluable though. For me personally, I needed to suffer Bob's eternal criticism of my below-average cardio every single time he accompanied me on the local running track, typically hovering next to me like a cynical balloon, commenting on any parameter in my physiology that didn't fit into Chinese standards for pilot fish, spacefarers or sentient beings in general. I often imagined turning his mechanical avatar into a blender or some other useful household appliance. Luckily things started getting interesting the first time they put me in the OD simulator. This was clearly a job for a multi-limbed cuttlefish or similar. The craft had an array of robotic arms and turned on a dime, on all axes. The controls weren't hard, but there were a lot of them. In the beginning I was content anchoring the craft and switching to the arms. But I was expected to work both the craft and the arms at the same time, and this really took some practice. I was able to rebind the craft controls to the series of foot pedals and then control the arms via my hands and an augmented reality interface. It was sort of like walking or sliding more accurately on a slippery surface while having incredibly long and strong arms with very precise heads-up display visual feedback. The simulation tank put me in what approximated zero gravity. NASA had built a submerged training version of Halcyon so that important procedures, such as redocking the many robot teams, could be rehearsed. OD was very close to a prototype, so I had to invent many of the maneuvers I needed to optimize the procedure of safely joining OD with Halcyon. Not just so I could get some well-needed rest, but also to save fuel. You see, every time I pushed or pulled at something, I would need to create an opposite thruster force to keep OD in place, or, as I found, I could just anchor OD using one arm and reach and position whatever needed docking with the other. It didn't take long before I was clambering all over the training ship like an excited octopus in search for morsels of goodness. One day Pris added another strange task to my list of things to do. It wasn't that much of a challenge, but she had learned about my nut diet via idle conversations during some of the few minutes of inactivity between drills, simulator training and hardware lectures. My new, must-do assignment was to change my eating habits to solely rely on the tube food we would be dependent on for the next 6 months. The exciting choice of flavors and contents was jellyfish, yuck, dragonfish, which was potentially poisonous, and kelp. I was trying to figure out what was wrong with my current menu of nuts, and Sit's explanation was something along the lines of us being role models for the folks back home and the news would present our story to high and low. That made us responsible in many ways we didn't realize, for instance what kind of food we would eat. So mission lead had suggested we convert to a new, yet thoroughly tested diet of abundant food sources, such as jellyfish. Another strange suggestion prompted by Pris was the sleepover. I suppose it was her semi-sexy way of selling the violation weekend. Popular sci-fi has always suggested some sort of stasis or cryo-sleep for long space voyages. I think mainly to let the spacefaring passengers actually experience their destination, if they were traveling to another solar system like Proxima Centauri. But in our case we simply needed to cut short our consumption of, well, everything. If we only had to transport 25% of the oxygen, water and food supply we would need during the interim months in transit, we would be able to save on fuel due to lower cargo weight, which in the big picture saved close to 1 billion credits from the project budget. I understood the reasoning, but didn't feel like undergoing the torpor treatment. The process is an artificial version of what some reptiles undergo during periods of drought or sparse food supply. Over the months training with the team, my tasks got increasingly more complex, putting a slight dent in my motivation, but my interest returned instantly the day we were flown to South America, where we got our rudimentary introduction to the new AHALP, Advanced Hybrid Airship Launch Platform, affectionately called AHAB, and Halcyon Moby Dick, by the ground crews, hinting to the tale of an old shark's manic hunt for a white whale. The Ahabs resembled enormous black barn swallows, their wings spanning nearly 1.2 miles from wingtip to wingtip, and their skin, made of photovoltaic cells, resembled feathers or reptilian scales. The massive vessels were each propelled forward by 8 electric windmill-sized counter-rotating propellers, and 4 smaller 6-bladed turboprops, also counter-rotating. On the first weekend, Shaw's prison said wanted to experience the nightlife in Buenos Aires and had made a deal with a local helicopter pilot concerning transport. I was so fascinated with the Ahab ships though that I stayed behind to study the crafts in detail. AG-39, nicknamed Aggie, the specially built spaceport was constructed on the southern coast of Argentina. Most of the facility buildings hung onto the shore cliffside like barnacles on a ship. Alongside were the cavernous hangars shielding the Ahabs from the weather and high seas. The giant birds were essentially seaplanes with hulls the size of cargo ships. Their takeoff was rumored to be spectacular. I couldn't imagine what it would feel like, seeing them accelerated by enormous electrical engines and stand upon hydrofoils to lift themselves out of the ocean, awe-inspiring I was sure. As soon as the craft hit 20 feet of altitude, the giant propellers would extend from their takeoff positions and deliver a staggering amount of propulsion, enough to carry the craft and 2 swing-wing hybrid rocket shuttles to an altitude of 50,000 feet. At this altitude, the prop blades would extend flap-like surfaces to find traction in the thin air, and the internal helium reservoirs would be approaching the confinement limits of their gas containers. But free from weather and significant air pressure, the 70-ton shuttles could be launched into space with very little atmospheric resistance, saving both fuel and credits, and allowing a space launch any day of the year, except under severe weather conditions, be those terrestrial or space-based. The Ahab ships were able to stay at altitude for a very long time. Since the vessels traveled at almost 700 kilometers per hour, they could, if they kept their latitude, stay on the day side of the planet, allowing them to recharge their batteries from the sun continuously. This energy recovery system was bolstered by 2 super-effective fuel cells that converted energy from atmospheric water vapor. Staying aloft continuously allowed the 2 launches to be executed at the right moment corresponding to their planned orbit service points. We would be staying in our crew capsule on the shuttle the entire 2 hours going up though. The Ahabs were autonomous and only had small service spaces on board that would fit us. They were inaccessible from the sealed shuttles anyway, since both launches would be tucked away in underwing launch bays until we hit our ceiling altitude. Coming back to Argentina, the Ahab would slowly descend into the troposphere, cycling through its remaining batteries. The ships were built to have 2 power banks left for landing and were capable of jettisoning most of the remaining depleted battery weight in case of an emergency. Ideally over cooperating national waters. These units would survive using traditional parachutes and inflatables, later to be picked up by drone copters that would ferry them safely back to Aggie for recharge and re-implementation. The Ahab would now be light enough to land on the sea near the spaceport if it was experiencing problems, even with several engines malfunctioning. This was of course a problem during bad weather, but since the ships could stay aloft for very long periods of time, they often had no problems timing their descent with the South Atlantic storms. Chapter 2: Going Up. The days in Aggie got increasingly more exciting as we spent time preparing and were able to observe the Ahabs delivering stores to our Halcyon Ark. An unmanned Halcyon had set sail the year before and had already delivered its cargo. It was now idling in Mars orbit, waiting for the manned Halcyon to smooth out a long string of wrinkles, both in the robot families it had delivered, but also in damages it had sustained itself. To lessen confusion we called first Halcyon 1, and our Halcyon 2. I couldn't wait. Much of the cargo that went up to Halcyon 2, we even had a chance to interact with before it left Earth. Bob wanted us to establish a relation to at least one of the robot families we would be maintaining so many of when we arrived. I remembered Pris describing their setup. 2 multi-purpose rovers, 1 flyer and 1 spider. So when I met them I had a rather tooly mindset and didn't expect their personalities. Bob had picked the second US family for us, the A-Team. He introduced us flatly to MP Rover 1, Hannibal, MP Rover 2, Mr. T, Spider, Face and Flyer, Murdoch. The family was finalizing trials in the Aggie sandbox, running retests of their factory specs in a sterilized environment that mimicked an alien surface, based on sand and pebbles. In the search of life on other worlds, the space agencies made sure no Earth-based bacteria, or resilient life like water bears were carried to another world and mistaken for alien life. So when we met the family we had to don hazmat-esque suits to keep our own little bacteria colonies contained. I suspect they were particularly attentive to Sit's halitosis. We were introduced to our trial robot family landscape in a scenario where all communication had broken down and we had to reset, repair or manually direct the problem-stricken family back on course. Commonly the multi-rovers would be in digger mode or construction. Both modes meant they would be fitted with either a large dozer, drill arm and anchors or several large arms and anchors. The latter made them look peculiar when they broke down, like van-sized creatures flailing their many limbs in a slow-motion panic, trying to free themselves of their geological predicament. Bob was accompanying us as his proxy hover drone, but since we were emulating a solar incident, where radio and Wi-Fi would be down, he was running an offline variant of himself on the drone, meaning we wouldn't have to deal with his infinite wisdom on this mission. I am getting ahead of myself. Bob is great for many things, but due to his virtual personality, he often comes across as a know-it-all, but he really does know pretty much anything. I guess you can think of him as a very improved Siri or Alexa. A personal assistant that doesn't give you a lecture on the color purple when you ask it to play Deep Purple. Under any circumstances Bob's offline drone was directing the trial mission, pointing out the robots that needed help and in what way. The mission landscape was defined by a central problem. The Hannibal rover had gotten stuck in bedrock while drilling one of the colony test templates. The drill was probably broken, so as a precursor to our mission we had been provided with a 3D printed drill head made from simulated regolith, and a few exotic components like the teeth made from tungsten carbide. The drill bit weighed in at about 200 kilograms, so we were using a small unsmart vehicle that would be on the nice-to-have cargo manifest, in other words, things that could come on the Halcyon mission if the science fish could guarantee we wouldn't need the cargo capacity for retro boost fuel. Extra braking power didn't sound unimportant and I mused to myself what tragic comedy it would be if we crashed on or bypassed Mars because we had brought along a joyride, named Dust Babe. The sandbox was about 500 meters by 500 meters in size and cooled to about -50 degrees Celsius. The ambient light in the area was dimmed to simulate the immediate aftermath of a sandstorm. Pris had murmured tau value 5.5 when the officer briefed us on the details. I didn't understand more than that it was a brightness value maybe. Said was commenting on how the warm climate in here reminded him of the weather back in Russia. Shores and I didn't have enough experience with Siberian og wherever Said was talking about, so omitted a witty comeback. We were monitored by Bob and he in turn was monitored from the control room by Pris and her associates. There wasn't much conversation going on from her side either. I suppose we were all getting anxious about the upcoming launch and the prospect of leaving Earth for a fairly long time. Babe was equipped with a cable drum that slowly trickled out a wire that led back to command. Normally this would be a safety precaution in sandstorms and when radio broke down. The wire led the control room monitor us directly without the concern for loss of comms. And I suppose in some funny way it made Babe look like a huge cable-controlled children's toy. Trundling along in the cold sand and simulated regolith we slowly drove our unsmart rover to our destination. We could probably have done it faster, but the large aluminium barrel wheels kicked up a lot of dust, so to maintain a minimum of visibility we had set it for a cruise speed around 30 km per hour. The inside of my helmet had a heads-up display that allowed me to follow the route, points of interest and mission parameters exactly. The name Hannibal was blinking straight ahead in amber caps. We would arrive shortly. Shores got up and easily dismounted Babe. Bob had slowed it to a walking pace so he stuck the landing gracefully.
Come on Nate, let's see if we can fix this robot rover.
His radio voice full of static even at this distance. I sure hoped the hardwire didn't have the same difficulty sending signals to the control room. If this went south, I didn't want to be stuck here through lunch. I was famished. My belly rumbled in concurrence. Hannibal sat with all anchors deployed and a drill arm hidden in the dust. The robot was quietly awaiting its drill bit replacement and had set its personality module to idle. But as we arrived, I could tell the robot was getting jittery from the heads-up data I was receiving. The robot personalities didn't serve much other purpose than to make interfacing with them a social encounter, the importance of which Pris hadn't been able to stress enough. Being stuck on another world with only a few other beings to socialize with could be problematic, so the eggheads in the science department cooked up a rudimentary personality for the robots we would be traveling with. They weren't too bright, but did their job perfectly. Some of them came with humor modules that allowed them to run harmless shenanigans. I sincerely hoped they would be funnier than Bob. The rudimentary purpose for the personalities was to ensure that we wouldn't feel the heavy isolation of living in the first Martian colony at a population level of 4.
Hello Nate, my name is Hannibal. I am excited to meet you. I would shake your hand, but right now I have Drillhead 0001 mounted and it is stuck in simulated bedrock, so I cannot. I am sorry.
The Hannibal rover blurted out suddenly as I approached it. The voice in my earpiece was full of static, but came through reasonably. I opened my mic and sent a formal hello back and did a small greeting gesture. Hannibal reacted by twitching, unable to do whatever it was it wanted to, because of its predicament. Said was mumbling to himself, uttering a few obscenities. He sat staring down the hole Hannibal had been boring, hunched over near the edge. He sort of looked like a big white mushroom with a glass dome hat.
The simulation guys sure gave us a challenge here, Nate.
He looked up at me as I walked around Hannibal, who followed us both with its masked cameras. The drill bit sat clenched in bedrock and the drill arm had buckled under torsion, or so the exercise had been designed from the simulation planning team. It meant we had to take apart most of the arm and requisition a new part which we hadn't brought along. Apparently Hannibal's self-diagnostic system hadn't reported the arm broken. So we only carried the drill bit on Babe and that was it. Luckily we had backup in the other MP rover, the Spider and the Flyer. Shaw's said and I agreed it would be easiest to have Pris print up a new arm and have the Flyer bring it to us. I found its private channel in the comms menu on my heads-up display and requested its assistance. My HUD symbol indicated it was recharging on the drone pad in the simulated colony, so it didn't take long for it to send a status and confirmation. Luckily we had the hard wire. If I had to send via radio, the signal might have been severely garbled, perhaps omitting the order for the Flyer to wait for Pris to load it with the newly printed arm. Said and Shaw's managed to take apart the arm on Hannibal. The bent arm piece had to be cut through with a laser running on the batteries from Babe. The torsion made it crack violently when the tortured piece was finally released from its structural stress. Said put his full strength on a crowbar he had wedged in between the unbolted hinge of the arm and grunted as he pulled the damaged stump away. Hannibal's suspension immediately compensated, causing the empty remaining arm to wave around comically. Said laughed a strange radio static voice on the comms.
He looks like drunk moose.
The moment was hilarious and we all joined in, except Pris that calmly reminded us to keep a professional tone on the radio. The Flyer Murdoch hummed into our small camp with the freshly printed arm, the drone playing a guitar track I didn't recognize on its external speaker. I suppose again an attempt at socializing with us, and it worked. I saw Shaw's rock his head enjoying the rhythm and mouthing some of the words. Having delivered the new part, Murdoch settled on Babe waiting to be retasked or transported back to camp with us. The music kept playing. We set the part in place, only having to grind a few shavings off of the 3D print. Once done, Hannibal was able to mount the replacement drill bit from Babe. Now all we needed to do was to remove the broken drills so the work could continue. Shaw's and I were discussing towing the bit out, but recognized several problems since it had already ruined the arm of Hannibal. Said had been rummaging around in the cargo pod of Babe and after a while returned with 2 sets of plastic explosives.
I will take care of this, you just stay back. No problem.
JAWGS was about to protest and Bob was flashing several objections in our huts, but since we hadn't been able to come up with a solution between him and Bob didn't present a plan, Sid's alternative made sense, in a violent kind of way. We backed up Babe about 50 meters, Hannibal followed, Murdoch brooded on the back of Babe, playing dramatic rock and roll, and I briefly wondered how it would repeat the music in hard vacuum where sound couldn't manifest. I was sure it was programmed to stay off the radio, but it seemed like these robots had a will of their own. Maybe that was just me falling for their virtual intelligence.
Небезпека.
Explosion soon,
said as he jogged towards us, unfurling a thin wire connected to the planted explosives and a small control box. We all knelt down behind the barrel wheels of Babe. Even Hannibal had positioned itself with Babe between it and the drill pit. It felt like a silly precaution. The pit was conical, so the blast would be directed upwards and we would most likely be covered in a layer of dust after the explosion, but nothing more. You can never be too careful with explosives though.
here we go,
said Winked.
Fire in the hole.
JAWGS said. The sound was deafening. We felt a shockwave and then the dust came. It was thick and swirled around us like a grey mist. I could barely make out a hand in front of me.
How much explosive did you use, Set?
JAWGS shouted, clearly frustrated over the dust storm.
enough.
Said grinned, thumbs-upping us, his childish cackling only barely understandable due to our proximity.
What the heck are you idiots up to? You fractured the compound roof.
The hardwire link carried Prez's voice clearly.
We're recovering the broken drill bit. Explosives seem to be an easy solution.
JAWGS explained via the link.
You realize you're in a training facility. That means a confined space, and that means, don't use large amounts of explosives, you idiots.
Prez continued for a while until Said interrupted her.
Yes, I am sorry, the problem is solved.
She immediately reprimanded him and made sure we knew this would have consequences. I later found out that on Aggie consequences typically meant kitchen duty. In this case, for the three of us, I personally had the honor of peeling potatoes for 6 hours straight. Luckily we had Sid's hearty singing as entertainment. Naturally the debriefing wasn't a comfortable experience. We got the usual reprimanding and threats of both pay cuts and diminished privileges. Our wrongdoing was mainly the explosives part. Other than that, our mission was a success. The blast had actually moved the broken drill out of the bedrock, and it was still in big enough pieces to allow us to recycle most of it in the shredder, so it could be printed into something new, and the tungsten carbide parts held up excellently, allowing them to be implanted in a new drill. Exotic materials would be precious away from Earth. Over time we would be able to create them after successful mining and fabrication plants had been created, but in the beginning everything needed to be used as many times as possible, especially our drill bits and heat shields. Our final training mission before we were allowed to board our shuttle and Ahab for the ascent and coupling with our heavenly ark, was the simulated Halcyon trials, another submerged mock-up version, this time, of the actual living space we would occupy when we set sails for Mars. Halcyon was a modular vessel, an interplanetary freight truck as Doc called it, so our training mission was composed of modules that corresponded to the vessel configuration we would be traveling with. That meant a large engine component containing the Vassimer thrusters, or as Doc called them, the Jalapeno engines, with them internal fuel tanks, batteries and solar panels. Then an extendable ship core that was basically a very long boom with a corridor in the middle of a series of functional elements that commonly alternated between a hatch to the externally attached module and a tank for our internal water stores, who also doubled as radiation insulation for a sleeping pod. All in all we had 8 such groups in each direction of the corridor, so 8 groups up, 8 groups starboard, 8 groups port and 8 down when considered as bulkheads. They were referred to as 1 array, 2 array, 3 array etc. We were only 4 passengers, so the remaining sleeping pods were used for provisions, emergency oxygen tanks, our space suits, spare parts like filters for the CO2 scrubbers, and, as I learned later, Sid's balalaika. The trip to Mars may have been a lot faster with the plasma engines, but we would probably still have to endure heavy bursts of solar or galactic radiation on the way. Luckily Halcyon had warning systems that should afford us at least a 30-minute warning before having to button up, as Shaw's called it. Everyone knew the procedure, and that's one of the things we drilled extensively on the mock-up vessel. Calmly stop what you were doing and make your way to a sleeping pod, preferably one with an entertainment system, and then wait out the storm. The simulation ran dry for the first week, so normal Earth gravity, and then wet the week after, meaning the eggheads filled the pool around the vessel with water to create an environment that resembled microgravity. NASA called this neutral buoyancy. This allowed me to practice with Odie again. Although the water restricted its movements as before, it was now easier to move around on Halcyon, having my muscles remember the controls and not constantly having to think about how to go where I wanted. I even felt so extra I did a few party tricks, like somersaults or pirouettes. Shaw's, Zed and Priz were all equipped with space diving suits when on the outside of Halcyon performing maintenance, so suddenly I was the big guy. I enjoyed this and played a few pranks on Zed, until I was reprimanded by Priz, and of course Zed rewarded me with a sore arm when we got back in. Priz had basic Odie operating skills, but the cockpit was very small and she only fit barely, due to her slender frame. She was my backup however. There were 2 Odies and they were parked on the 7-ray hatches, near the front of Halcyon. We carried the extra Odie for redundancy, but also to speed up orbital assembly and finally to maintain symmetry in the cargo load of the Ark. The Vasimer engines would nudge us to high speed, but the relative hard retro boosting would be handled by conventional engines on board the EDLR. Entry, descent, landing and return vehicle occupying the nose of Halcyon. This meant cargo symmetry was important so we didn't develop serious vibrations causing structural damage during braking. The EDLR was curiously called Edsel, almost Scandinavian for donkey. I was told it could be a reference to a vintage car. Supposedly it was a failed Ford brand, but the name was probably just a mutation on the letters EDLR. The Edsel on Halcyon was our landing and return vehicle. It was also Halcyon's brake and nose thruster. To make sure it had enough fuel to take off from Mars and return us to the Halcyon, it used all of the 8-array mountings for fuel pods while braking. We would dump these and our empty oxygen tanks while landing on Phobos so the colony could refuel them and resupply us when we hit the Martian moons on the way back. In conclusion, our gravity-boosted trajectory would be Earth to lunar orbit, to Phobos orbit, then Mars orbit and then land. We were all getting very excited. Our neutral buoyancy exercise finalized and the last night we spent on the submerged training version of Halcyon. We celebrated over dinner with a little wine, stories and sits singing. Each of us contributed with our own cultural aspects. This concludes the audiobook prototype. Thank you for listening. For more information please go to www.patreon.com/JAWGS.